To me, it was the most interesting thing happening in the world. I mean, the idea that a president of the United States could potentially be compromised, they made a decision not to investigate Trump's financial dealings with Russia and individuals from the former Soviet Union. And the reason why is basically because they thought they were going to get fired if they did. This is this invisible force that impacts all of our lives in ways that are not particularly easy to notice,
Yeah.
but are profound. Fundamentally, they want to know, did Russia change the outcome
Right.
of the election?
Hello and welcome. My name is Travis Beauchamp. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and with me today is Peter Grant Jr., author of While We Slept. This is your first book. It's a massive book. I know I've known you for a long time. I've known your kind of trajectory and getting interested in geopolitics, all that kind of stuff. What started you off interested in this subject? What got you onto this subject?
Well, I guess kind of taking the longer view, my grandfather was a history professor. My father was a PhD historian. I've always been interested in history, and in particular, growing up, I was interested in the history of the Second World War. And that kind of got me interested in Russia and the Soviet Union. Then, funnily enough, the game Command and Conquer Red Alert, I was a big fan of that game, and it inspired me to read a biography of Joseph Stalin. And actually, I started reading quite seriously about the history of Russia and the Soviet Union. I was lucky enough when I was 18, I actually traveled to Russia. I traveled to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And then my interest in American politics also goes back a very long time. I had the opportunity to work in 2008 on the Obama presidential campaign in Ohio. I did so again in 2012, and that experience kind of gave me a little bit of an insight into how presidential campaigns actually work. And so this book is fundamentally about a presidential campaign, the Trump campaign and its interactions with Russia. And so that was kind of what got me interested in it. And I've been writing my entire life, mostly fiction. And so when this extraordinary series of events started to unfold, I got really fascinated into, I guess we can get into exactly more kind of what happened in 2016 and why I got interested in it. So during the election itself, I was aware of the reporting by the Washington Post. Ellen Nakashima, an investigative reporter there, reported, I believe in June of 2016, that the Russians were behind the hacking of the DNC and the Clinton campaign. But at that time, I read about that and I thought it was interesting, but I wasn't consumed by it. It was really only after Trump got elected, and in particular in the first few weeks of his presidency, the event which really sparked my interest was the resignation of Michael Flynn. When it was later determined that he lied about his conversations with the Russian ambassador Sergei Kislyak. He lied both to FBI agents, which was a felony, but what really spurred my interest was the fact that he actually lied to Vice President Pence. And it was at that time, and this was very early on, this was in the first month of the Trump presidency, and it was at that point that I started reading more about Trump's relationship and the relationship of people in his administration to Russia, and in particular to individuals quite close to Vladimir Putin. And so then essentially what happened was I started reading about this issue, and I realized that it was absolutely extraordinarily complex. And so I started to basically make a list of articles on an email that I circulated among a few people that I thought might be interested, and basically listed out the articles that I thought you should read if you wanted to stay abreast of what was happening. And if you'll recall, there was a great deal happening at that time.
I remember that email list.
Yes, and that email list expanded into an Excel document. And basically, over a period of about 2.5 years, I kind of religiously added every article that I ever read about that topic into this large Excel document with titles of the articles, the dates they were released, and eventually midway through 2019, I had somewhere in the vicinity of 9,000 articles.
Jesus.
And basically, I had not really intended to write a book about it. It was just something that I thought was, to me, it was the most interesting thing happening in the world. I mean, the idea that a president of the United States could potentially be compromised by one of our main adversaries, Russia, was just mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
And then, long story short, in September of 2019, I decided to take a step back from my professional responsibilities. I was organizing health policy conferences at that time and just try my hand. I was going to take 6 months to basically write something. I didn't know what that was, and I also didn't know that we were about to have a once in a century pandemic occur. And so I took 6 months off, isolated myself before it was cool, and then basically started writing. And then the pandemic basically gave me a much more time than I'd initially anticipated. And I ultimately spent about 2.5 years writing the book. And this is the final product.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, there's absolutely no question about the prolific nature of your writing. You've been writing for ever since I've known you, essentially. But I know one of the first questions that people are going to ask about this, there's a few that'll probably happen, but one of them is going to be, why should we trust your assessment about a lot of these things? Since you're not a professional journalist, you are, absolutely fascinated by these things. Why should people kind of look at your writing and be able to trust it?
Yeah, so I tried to write it in a way that didn't require trust on anyone's part. Just let me try to explain. So the book itself has over 2,500 footnotes and citations, and I try to very rigorously stay away from opinion statements and keep it almost tediously factual. And but because the truth is that I was concerned as I was writing, I wanted to get it right. And these are complicated matters. And so even if you try really hard, and in good faith, you can make mistakes. And so I very assiduously tried to footnote and show that every single claim that the book's made, that I make in the book, if the reader is interested, they'll know exactly where I got it and be able to read it for themselves. So I don't want anyone to just trust me. I'm really just trying to make a series of factual statements and show where those facts came from, so people can follow it up themselves.
Yeah. And have you sent this to any other, experts in the field that might be able to verify like this is actually you're on the right path kind of thing?
I've shared it with multiple professors from various universities. I'm a little bit hesitant to drop names.
Okay.
But to answer your question, yes, I have. I've shared it fairly widely. It's been available. The articles have been available online, and I'm confident that the fact claims in the book can be backed up and verified.
It is crazy to think that actually 2016 was almost a decade ago at this point, and because politics does move incredibly quickly, a lot of people almost think of that era of American history as ancient history. Why do you think it is still relevant these days to be talking about these issues, that you uncovered and that you've documented in the book?
Yeah, well, my favorite line in American literature, which I'm going to paraphrase, was by William Faulkner, which was basically, the past is never over, it isn't even past. And basically, so Trump is running, so we're in the middle of the 2024 election as we're recording this right now. And and the candidate Trump was essentially the same man in 2016, just with quite a few more crimes and corrupt acts under his belt. The events of 2016 are essential to understanding the Trump presidency, the Trump political era itself. As I say in the book, it was the original sin of his presidency. And to understand how Trump found himself in the place of getting support from Russia. The book argues that you need to understand Trump's past going all the way back into the 1970s,
Right.
and so it's a hugely consequential event that occurred in our history. It'll be remembered for decades. It had a huge impact on presidential politics itself, and in fact, just recently, the FBI assessed that Iran hacked into the Trump campaign, of all people, Roger Stone, who there's two chapters of the book about. And so understanding those events, I think, are critical to appreciating where we are in our politics today.
Yeah. And it is, you tackle so much about Donald Trump, about his coming up in New York City and the party politics of Jersey City and New York City in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. But you also, like you mentioned, you cover Vladimir Putin just as much, and that connection there is fascinating to me. It's one of the most interesting parts that you weave those two stories together. Of course, one of the other things people are going to say is Russia, 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 which is his go-to line. What do you say to the people that their first knee-jerk reaction to seeing anything about Trump and Putin is to say that it's a hoax? It's Russiagate is a hoax.
Yeah, so there's a variety of different levels to this. Some of that is just partisan hackery. And so there's actually even a kind of, some of it is actually disinformation being promoted by uh, people involved with Russian intelligence, primarily the canard that Ukraine was actually guilty of election interference, and they invented this scandal whole cloth. That is a lie. It's a weaponized lie, and which was designed to kind of roil and divide our politics. So that you can take that kind of group of people and basically say, I really have nothing to say to them.
Yeah.
Then there are others who basically, somewhat understandably, there's a lot of confusing aspects about this story and things that distort it. One of the reasons why is the way that information was released about it over time. So if we go back to that period I was talking about early in the Trump presidency, when people kind of they knew generally that the Russians had something to do with the hacking, and then Michael Flynn was fired, rather resigned for lying about his interactions with the Russian ambassador. That was the time when BuzzFeed released the infamous Steele dossier. And the Steele dossier is a very controversial and complicated document. It was never intended for public release or consumption. In fact, most of the newspapers, when they first received it, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, didn't release it. And BuzzFeed made a controversial decision to release that document. And basically, in it was the enduring image that everyone salaciously associated with this story was that Trump was getting golden showers at the Ritz-Carlton in Moscow, and it really kind of presented him as essentially a long-term agent of Russia. And so there have been people who have been rightfully critical of that report and have said that much of what it asserted was unsubstantiated. And so that is narrowly correct. That's not to say that the report was entirely false or has been entirely discredited, but we do know that parts of it now don't appear to be true. And so for some people, they saw that and they basically associated everything with that report. And basically, they're like, there was no golden shower. Trump wasn't an agent.
Right.
And so to those people, I basically would point out, look, let's not look at the dossier. Let's look at the established facts, which I try to point out in my book. And none of the factual assertions that I make in my book have anything to do with the Steele dossier. Then there's another aspect. There's so many different levels to this. I think for a lot of people, they basically, the special counsel investigation by Robert Mueller took about 2.5 years to unfold. There was an immense amount of press attention while it was occurring. And then when they chose not to indict Trump, which they never were going to do in the first place because of an Office of Legal Counsel finding that says that a sitting president can't be indicted. For a lot of people, that moment was, well, there's nothing here.
Right.
And the Mueller report itself doesn't really help matters because it's written in this extraordinarily dense legalese. Much of it is redacted, and the Attorney General at that time, William Barr, knowingly and intentionally distorted and misled the American public about the findings of the Mueller report to the point that Mueller wrote a letter saying as much. And then the later subsequent reports, the Senate Intelligence Report was released to no fanfare whatsoever at the heart of the pandemic. And really, after the Mueller report was released, then there was the first impeachment, which involved Ukraine, and that was quickly followed by COVID and the 2020 election. And so I think that there are a lot of perfectly legitimate, reasonable people who basically say, well, look, the special counsel didn't indict him. There's no there. Let's all move on. And I would say to them that if you read the Senate Intelligence Report and you look at all the totality of the evidence, basically Mueller was making a very narrow kind of threading the needle point of being, well, we can't 100% establish, we don't have an email from Donald Trump saying, hey Vlad, thanks for hacking, and so they basically made a very conservative prosecutorial decision not to indict a standing president. I mean, they were never going to do that in the first place.
Right.
So there, to those people, I would just point them towards the evidence that the overwhelming circumstantial evidence of the case shows that Donald Trump knew what the Russians were doing as they were doing it. There were multiple different vectors of potential communications, whether it was his campaign chairman who was sharing campaign polling data with Russian intelligence officers and was holding meetings with Russian intelligence officers, whether it was his oldest, that was Paul Manafort, whether it was his oldest political advisor and close personal friend, Roger Stone, who was in communications over Twitter direct message with the Russian military intelligence and WikiLeaks. He had foreign policy advisors who were informed that the Russians had Hillary's emails before it was public knowledge. His son was meeting with, and his campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, were meeting with Russian lawyers, Natalia Veselnitskaya, who was super close with Russian intelligence and was running information operations both through Trump Tower and the United States Congress. And the fact that the Trump Tower Moscow deal was all going on throughout this entire time period. And so if you look at the totality of the evidence, there absolutely, it was a there. It was completely inappropriate. Whether or not it was illegal, I happen to think much of it was, but people can debate that. But nonetheless, there absolutely was a there. It was something that everyone should be concerned about. And it's unfortunate that the American politics has largely seemed to move on, but it's somewhat understandable because there's so many other important pressing issues, and this was in 2016.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, if we don't keep our eye on the ball here, it could potentially happen again.
Those are excellent points. One of the things that I really loved about the way that you approached this book and kind of explaining the whole thing is, as you say, kind of steering away from speculation and things that, you can't support with evidence. Because there are, and you detail this a lot in your book, so many pieces of evidence that support the idea that there was a connection between Trump and Eurasian organized crime and the intelligence services with Russia. Why is it that there have been no investigations, no official investigations into his financial dealings with Eurasian organized crime?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the way that the investigation unfurled, and I'm talking about the Crossfire Hurricane investigation, which was the FBI investigation that began during the 2016 campaign. So this
Yeah.
was before they actually didn't start investigating Donald Trump. The investigation got kicked off because Trump's foreign policy advisor George Papadopoulos told an Australian diplomat that the Russians had informed him that the Russians were in possession of Hillary Clinton's emails and they wanted to use them. They wanted to use them to help the Trump campaign. And so the initial investigation actually started out into George Papadopoulos. And it slowly widened as the various people around Donald Trump began to reveal more and more highly suspicious connections to Donald Trump. It eventually um, encompassed Paul Manafort, it encompassed Michael Flynn, and it encompassed Roger Stone. And it was only actually after Donald Trump fired James Comey that the FBI actually opened up a counterintelligence investigation into Trump. At that point, Robert Mueller was appointed special counsel, and he had essentially, and I have a fair amount of sympathy for Mueller, even though it was a pretty ultimately flawed investigation. Basically, Mueller had to kind of decide what to do, and there was kind of the sword of Damocles over him the entire time because Trump could fire him at any moment. And so essentially what happened is he decided not really to pursue a counterintelligence investigation. He decided to narrow it to really be a prosecutorial criminal investigation. And then, as Andrew Weissman wrote in his book, Where Law Ends, they made a decision not to investigate Trump's financial dealings with Russia and individuals from the former Soviet Union. And the reason why is basically because they thought they were going to get fired if they did. And I think, now this is a little bit of speculation on my part. I believe that Mueller basically believed that an imperfect investigation, an ongoing imperfect investigation, would be better than no investigation at all, and that would have sparked a constitutional crisis, and there just simply weren't the votes in Congress to get him impeached.
Right.
And then the other groups just simply didn't really have the power to do it. There were other investigations. There were congressional investigations. The House investigation first was run. So if you'll recall, when Trump was elected, the Republicans held both the House and the Senate. And so the Republican-led investigations in the House was a complete sham.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, they were just carrying water for the president, the Republican president, and the Senate investigation was a much more serious investigation, but they just didn't have the power. They didn't have subpoena power that the Department of Justice would have had to basically get their hands on these documents and really look into Trump's financial entanglements. And to me, one of the biggest mysteries, and one that bears further research, is what was the nature of the IRS investigations into Trump? Because there appear, if you'll recall, the reason why he said that he would never release his tax returns was because he was under IRS audit. We know he was being audited for actions he took vis-a-vis his Trump Tower Chicago, and that lasted for a very long time. But it's not entirely clear if there were any other investigations. And so then there have been a New York State in the
Right.
civil case, but again, they were looking more narrowly at things related to bank fraud, and they weren't really looking into money laundering and things like that of that nature. So I think basically the real reason why that happened was because as president of the United States, he had the ability to fire the people who were doing it.
Yeah.
So
So a lot of the people that you've detailed in the book, Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, people connected in the Trump universe that were connected to Russian intelligence through various means, um, are still around him, are still advising him. Paul Manafort was on the floor of the RNC, just walking around. There's even rumors that he might be back in the campaign in some capacity, official capacity at some point. Do you think that this has gotten worse? This particular situation has gotten worse around him since then?
Yes, I do, but not necessarily regarding Russia. Our relationship has declined so profoundly with Russia, particularly ever since they invaded Ukraine, and under the EU and the Biden administration actually has now put on some sanctions with teeth and financial regulations. That being said. I'll just use an example of Jared Kushner, who received $2 billion from Mohammed bin Salman and is now developing former Soviet naval bases in Albania, and which partially was, made possible through Trump's former ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell. So the point being is that foreign money. I mean, even just more recently, we heard about the potential that the Egyptian president gave Egyptian intelligence gave Donald Trump $10 million during the 2016 election, which was investigated by Mueller but shut down by William Barr. But the larger point being is that. It's not simply Russia. There are a lot of other players out there, particularly in the Middle East, but also elsewhere, Asia, various wealthy oligarchs from all over the world who basically are funneling money. I mean, and look, it's not just a Republican problem, right? I mean, Senator Menendez in New Jersey was being provided gold bars. So I would say that. People playing fast and loose with campaign finance laws, with obviously just violating basic morality and accepting dirty money from corrupt and in some cases murderously corrupt places, is a major problem in our politics. Russia, played a huge. It was their moment in 2016, and they're going to continue to do that. They're attempting to interfere, and they attempted to interfere in the 2020 election primarily through entrapping Hunter Biden, and they're going to continue to do that. But I would be less concerned strictly about Russia, although we do need to keep our eyes on them. But to say this is actually a much wider phenomenon, I do think that it's far worse in the Republican Party at this current moment in time. But we have a problem with it among Democrats. Menendez in New Jersey, and I would argue Eric Adams in New York. Yeah, so it is a very serious problem. And so sometimes when people, I think, go like, well, why are you so narrowly focused on Russia? Well, I happen to write a book about the history of the 2016 election, and they were the people doing it. But moving forward, I think it's instructive to read the book and to realize that it's not just the Russians that are doing it, and it's a very serious problem.
In that sense, actually, it is almost like a slice, like an example. Like, this is who these people are. Believe them when they first tell you that.
Yeah, and it just happens to be that the man who has been the absolute leader of Russia for over 2 decades was a KGB officer.
Yeah.
Who was, and I point this out in the book. He became a man essentially in the KGB. He traveled to East Germany, where he lived in Dresden, and saw a totalitarian system in a heavily propagandized public. And then he returned to Russia, where he was involved, and the people around him were involved in the manipulation of domestic elections. They were involved in the manipulation of elections, certainly in Ukraine and across Eastern Europe. We know that they were involved in funding far-right parties in Germany and in France and in the United Kingdom. They supported Catalonian separatists in Spain, and they've been involved in all kinds of coups across Central Africa, and so why should we be surprised that what the KGB always referred to as the main adversary, the United States, that they would be involved in attempting to manipulate our elections.
Yeah.
And this just goes back to a point. I often get this question when people ask me, why did you write about that? Fundamentally, they want to know, did Russia change the outcome
Right.
of the election? And I don't argue that in my book. I argue that it's actually absolutely impossible to know. I mean, we could argue forever about whether the fact that James Comey reopened the FBI investigation into Hillary Clinton regarding her foundation emails, whether that tipped the election. The truth is, there's no way to establish that it did. And so, what I argue in the book is that if you want to understand the 2016 election and try to understand the outcome, which I think no one would deny was one of the most important elections of at least the 21st century, you have to make reference to what the Russians were doing and try your best to understand it.
Obviously, a lot has happened since you started putting together all those thousands upon thousands of articles about this particular moment in political history. Since 2016, we've had, as you say, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've had the President of the United States attempting to blackmail the Ukrainian president. We've had all kinds of scandals around him, including the documents scandal. Have any of these events, has anything since you started working on this particular slice of political history changed your conclusions about it, for better or for worse?
Not really. Look, I spent a lot of time reading about the 2016 election. I would put myself up there with anybody.
Yeah.
And there's still things that come out. I mean, just a few weeks ago, when we learned that the Egyptian president Sisi had met with Donald Trump, and that what was it, $9.8 million was taken from Egyptian intelligence, a bank account associated with Egyptian intelligence, and was removed. And then Donald Trump donated $10 million to his own campaign. And we know for a fact now that that was being investigated by Robert Mueller and his team, and that the investigation was shut down by William Barr.
Yeah.
So, in all the time that I was reading about 2016, I'd never came across this. So that just emphasizes the fact that his campaign was for sale, essentially.
Yeah.
No, not really. I mean, most of the information that has come to light and most of the activities of the individuals who I was reading about, their subsequent activities, has really only reinforced what my original conclusions were, that this was a pretty corrupt group of people.
So let's say the unthinkable happens. We wake up in November and it's Trump's second term. What is worse this time around, knowing what you know now, having seen what you've seen? What should we be prepared for if that's what we wake up to?
Well, the people that I would be most concerned about would be the people of Ukraine, who almost certainly will be sold up the river and betrayed.
Yeah.
There's absolutely no reason, and what's particularly frightening about that, and it just goes to show the corrosive rot of Donald Trump, is that it's not just him anymore. It now his influence has been felt throughout a large part of the Republican Party, which now kind of almost looks like kind of a pre World War II isolationist kind of republicanism that doesn't seem all too concerned about international dictators. And so I would be most concerned about Ukraine. Again, the great irony is that Donald Trump ran on a platform of, quote, draining the swamp. And yet individuals like Paul Manafort and Roger Stone, both career lobbyists going back decades, they basically invented the swamp. And so I think another Another Trump presidency will just further establish the primacy of money in American politics. It'll be pay to play politics of the worst variety. And it won't just be American business interests, but also foreign dictators and strongmen and corruption that will be ascendant in
Yeah.
Washington. And
Yeah.
we already saw that um, in his first 4 years. He'll just be much more unabashed, if that's even possible, in the next 4 years, which is why we have to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah. Well, if you had your way, if you had complete control of the investigatory powers that the United States has, how would you go about? Where would you like to know more? Because obviously you ran up against some walls, and one of the major conclusions of the book is that there are certain things that the Trump administration successfully prevented investigations into through obstruction of justice. If you had the power of the state to go after and investigate those things, where would you concentrate on?
Yeah, so as important as investigating Trump is, and it is very important, the truth is that Trump is really only one part of a much wider phenomena. And he became so important because he rather unexpectedly became the president of the United States. But the truth is, and I write significantly about this in the book, that when the Soviet Union fell, there was an ocean of dirty money that was basically taken from the former Soviet Union and repatriated into the Western financial system, particularly in the United Kingdom and the United States and in the property markets of London and New York. And so Donald Trump was a real estate magnate in New York and was doing a lot of international branding deals and international real estate deals. And so he obviously played a prominent role in that process. But there were many others.
Yeah.
And so to me, the most interesting question is who in the West was helping facilitate that movement of money? And so I would take a much broader brush than simply looking at Donald Trump, although it would encompass his activities, and basically try to look into who were the financial leaders and the political leaders that enabled this kind of epochal crime to take place. And I also think that would not only shine a light in uncomfortable places here in the United States, but also in Russia, because the truth is that Vladimir Putin's the power structure that underlies his dictatorship is essentially the very small, wealthy oligarchic elite in Russia basically support his regime because they know that he's not going to go after their dirty money. And most of these people, the major oligarchs, have their money in the West, less so after the Ukrainian war, but it still is prominent. So I would like to take a look into that aspect, kind of a much broader historical survey, and also try to get some answers out of American intelligence, because presumably they know and have records about some of this stuff, as does the FBI. So look through our own intelligence and law enforcement records, and try to get to the bottom of this kind of stuff.
So you dropped a few hints there in discussing what you might do with investigatory power about where you might potentially be interested going forward. And I know we've had discussions about this, about what your research has kind of pulled you towards in terms of, intelligence and that connection with organized crime. Would you be willing to give a hint of where you might be going next if you want to pursue this kind of writing?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
So when I started this project, I at first was somewhat narrowly concerned about was Donald Trump involved in laundering money from Russia or from the former Soviet Union? And as I started reading about that, I realized that I could not understand that, and without understanding the wider context of why are the Russians laundering money. And it was really when I started reading about that that I got interested in writing the book.
Yeah.
And the short answer is that um, elements of the KGB, their Foreign Intelligence Directorate, understood as late as the late 70s that the Soviet Union was economically terminally in decline and there was no righting the ship. And so they grew concerned that once the Communist Party fell, all the money that was controlled by the Communist Party would just be taken by the new leaders of Russia. And so that was the first reason why they started moving that money into the West. And some of those individuals that were involved in that process have remarkably close rub shoulders almost with Donald Trump, and I get that into that in the book. But as I started reading about that, um, I basically started to ask the even larger question of why is there money laundering? Um, what is this phenomenon? Why is it happening? Because the more I read about it, the more I realized that this is this invisible force that impacts all of our lives in ways that are not particularly easy to notice,
Yeah.
but are profound. Things, for example, like how much you pay for your rent,
Mm-hmm.
or things like that. And as I started to read about the history of money laundering, it fundamentally involves, it started really in the United States, and it's related to the development of the IRS and the income tax. And if you start looking into really the earliest examples of money laundering were the early gangsters, people like literally like Al Capone,
Yeah.
Charlie Lucky Luciano, and in particular Meyer Lansky,
Yeah.
who is essentially kind of a criminal genius, a financial, brilliant financial criminal. And I got interested in reading about his money laundering networks, which just to briefly, the leader of the American mafia when the National Crime Syndicate was first established was a man named Charlie Lucky Luciano. He was childhood friends with Meyer Lansky, and Lansky basically was after Prohibition became involved in gambling, and and so he also opened up gambling casinos in Cuba, and then eventually they moved, after the Cuban Revolution, his money laundering network moved to the Bahamas.
Right.
And so I got interested in a company called Resorts International, which basically had a casino on Paradise Island in the Bahamas, and later funded the pro-legalization of casino gambling in New Jersey, which was the first state after Nevada, which for decades was the only state in the United States where you could gamble. And so, anyways, this company called Resorts International funded the legalization of gambling in the United States, in New Jersey, and Donald Trump bought the company. And so my next project is essentially telling the wider story of what happened there, and it has many other different connections. And so, just the long story short is starting from Trump and his interest in money laundering, and then getting interested in the wider phenomena of Russian money laundering, and then going back into the deeper question of why is this phenomena even occurring in our society. Oddly enough, then I said, oh my God, this takes me right back to Trump. And so that kind of, it kind of blew my mind, but I couldn't really, the book was way too long as it is, so I couldn't really get into it too much. And so that's what I'm researching right now, and I'm hoping to begin to release articles, if not later this year, early next year.
Well, that's amazing. I actually really am looking forward to that next book. This book, While We Slept, unbelievable piece of work. Highly recommend it if people want to learn more about what you're doing right now, or get more info from you. Can you give them some deets?
Well, I have a Medium page where I release my articles. There really isn't too much about me online. I'm sure that anyone who bothers to look was probably confused by that. But I try to let the book speak for itself.
Yeah.
If you're really interested, visit Amazon. It's available on paperback and ebook. While We Slept, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and the Corruption of American Democracy.
Peter Grant, excellent to talk to you as always.
Travis, thank you for having me.